Hi, this is Karen from Soterion. You're listening to the SAP Security and GRC podcast, helping you on your journey to effective access risk management in SAP. In today's episode, we'll be speaking about policies and procedures related to SAP Access risk management activities. Our host is Dudley Cartwright, and he will be joined by Andreea van Haaren from EY Sweden and Emile Steyn from Soterion. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to today's podcast, where we're going to be speaking about all things policies and procedures relating to SAP Access risk management activities. So, ensuring that a company has got up-to-date and relevant policies and procedures is of huge importance to all organizations, but we often find that many organizations' policies and procedures are actually quite outdated in relation to the processes that are actually taking place within the organization or within the business. So today's session, we're here to just talk about things like, why is it important to ensure that your policies and procedures are up to date and relevant? Some of the techniques or tips of how to ensure that these policies and procedures remain up to date, as well as what the value is to the business users or to the organization for ensuring that policies and procedures are up to date and relevant and reflective of what's actually happening within the organization. So I'm joined today by Andreea van Haaren from EY Sweden, as well as Emile Steyn from Soterion. So thank you very much, guys, for joining us today and obviously sharing your thoughts on all things policies and procedures related. Okay, so I think I've listed down a number of questions that we're going to try and cover in today's session. But Andreea, maybe if I can just ask you, first of all, maybe just share some of your thoughts relating to policies and procedures before we get into the actual questions. If you can just, sum it up and share some of your thinking around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm quite excited about this topic, particularly because, in fairness, it does not come natural to me. I'm a doer, so I hate when people tell me how to get stopped or how to, putting a framework around how I do things. Nevertheless, if I take also a bit of a life example, I'm married in a family that loves board games. So that's also not something that comes natural to me. So I sometimes tend to jump in, I'll just learn it along the way. Start playing and we'll figure it out. Yet, yes, it does bring you forward because you start moving your pieces and it's fun and you get like a really interesting momentum. But it always ends that there is frustration, especially if you're playing against somebody that's super competitive and likes winning and doesn't necessarily take joy in the process, because you don't know how to handle that specific situation as you haven't discussed the rules of the game at the beginning. So coming back to that and also reflecting back to now, I have 2 more months until I can say that I have 10-digit or 2-digit experience in SAP security. Reflecting that to my work and roles and authorizations, I genuinely see the benefit of sitting down at the beginning and discussing, guys, how do we want to do this? What are the rules of the game? What are the design principles? What are the stuff that's important for you as a company? And that applies to pretty much everything, I would say.
Yeah, and I think your analogy there is such a great analogy there, because as you say, as the game goes on, if there's no clearly defined rules or what's the process, it does result in frustration. And I think when we relate that back to SAP Access risk management activities, there often is a lot of frustration from the business users. And if they're getting frustrated, they're putting pressure then on the security teams, and which causes them to possibly bypass or take shortcuts, etc. But if the rules were clearly explained to the business users, they would understand why certain things need to be done in a certain way, and they would be more accommodating and be more patient, and they wouldn't jump and scream at the security administrators so quickly. I think relieving that business frustration is hopefully a huge sort of outcome of up-to-date policies and procedures. So, and I could. Okay, so I think just getting into some of those questions that I've listed down that I would like you to answer. So maybe just let's start straight off with, can you maybe just explain, what are policies and procedures, and why are they important to an organization to have well-defined policies and procedures relating to SAP Access Risk Management activities?
Well, first of all, why it's important, it has the fairly boring explanation that you need to abide to legal and statutory requirements. You have compliance, you have regulations that are sort of supported by a governing framework. But the other benefit that I see to it, and that's something that's not really spoken about it, primarily because it's not done right, and sometimes it's really done just as a tick in a box. You write a nice 200-page document, which you then shove in a SharePoint link that nobody knows its location, is that we don't use it as an accelerator for our business. So a governing policy and a framework should be something that comes back from business goals, as the way we assess, or every company sort of assesses their portfolio and assesses the way they operate in order to stay viable. I think we should be doing the same with our policies. And it's, in fairness, not only applicable to access management, because that's only one dimension, but also generally. We should make sure that or take the time to check that our rules of the game are still aligned to where we want to go as a company. And we very rarely do that, which leads, at least from an access management perspective, I've seen very sad moments in which we've worked for a redesign for almost 2 years. You come back 4 months later, and it's not a full mess, but as we have not taken into account how is the handover and the maintenance from a governance perspective defined, it's very easy to destroy good or structure when there is no governing structure around it.
I think what you mentioned there about some of the documentation of this put away in some SharePoint folder and not looked at it again. Emile, we've seen on some of our projects where if it's a biggish SAP project, like client moving to ECC or from ECC to S4, there's often a lot of effort put in, whether it's by the consulting company or the implementation partner, on almost also the defining what the process is. So a lot of effort goes into the business process flow documentation, as well as also the policies and procedures. But at go live, often, a lot of companies don't go back and sort of keep those, the company's processes change over time, but very few companies go back and really relook at their documentation and make sure and keep that up to date. So I often see a huge challenge with process flow documentation, as well as policies and procedure documentation, just getting outdated, very quickly, not being sort of maintained after the go live. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe to touch on that, so I think what we often see is that it's a matter of ownership of those different policies and procedures. So I think what a lot of organizations try to get away with is there's a central person that oversees all of these policies and procedures, but they don't really have a touch point with all of those different areas actually within the business or the different areas of IT. And ultimately, they get out of touch with what's really happening. So I think it is a case where you need to identify who's the correct people that's responsible for specific areas of the policy, whether that's in your access and management activities, whether that's actually in your basis settings, whether that is in compliance activities like your user access reviews. Identify who's the correct people for each of those areas, that if something changes, that they can take ownership of that small piece of their universe, and that they can make sure that that piece is updated and adhered to. Well, I also maybe just want to go back is to what Andreea said is, it should be policies and procedures. It's kind of seen as the brake, but it's actually the accelerator, because it's very much like mitigating controls. It's not actually meant to make the business go slow. It's actually meant to make you go faster, because now you clearly know what you need to do, how to do it, and who's responsible for what. So that should make everything actually easier to do. And yes, I think the frustration that you referred to earlier is because and we can maybe touch on that again later, is that the business doesn't fully understand why certain things are being done. And that's where education becomes quite important. If they understand why certain things are done in a certain way, why there's multiple approvals required for a specific access request, they'll probably understand that, that will ultimately save them time later, either maybe in a process that follows the existing one. Let's say, if we use an example, a user access request, it goes through multiple approvals. But if that is reviewed properly and approved, that again makes it easier when the user access review needs to be done, because then that access request actually went through appropriate approvals. Everyone knows why it was approved at that point in time. So that means it's a lot easier to do my user access review. There's just a silly example, but there's so many of those examples.
Yeah.
So mostly an education thing, and that will, I think, resolve a lot of the issues we see.
Yeah. So now, I think that's a good point, that we seldom see that there's clearly defined ownership of people within the organization of who's responsible for ensuring that those policies and procedures and the associated documentation is kept up to date.
I loved the mention that this piece of work, if it's a governing flow or a policy, it should really live across different departments. It shouldn't be just the risk manager that comes in, this is what you need to do. And I think there also needs to be a bit more understanding from the risk management function, as to be fair, from a very doer perspective, which now has slowly embarked into seeing the benefit of embedding risks in a smart way along your processes. I think there's also a bit of a need of reality check from risk management functions to come a bit closer to real risks and start speaking the business language, and not come like the adults that sort of break in the teenagers' party and start talking in ISO frameworks and sub-bullet points. So there is a bit of the need of creating a universal language. And policies tend to be that sort of wooden language, so to say. And having this cross-linkage and making such frameworks alive across the different departments, as you've also mentioned, I think that's super important. So implementing it is one thing, but keeping it alive and having the ownership, I think that's where the real effort comes in.
And we're going to talk about the regular reviews later, so that we'll get to that later. But for now, so we've covered the ownership, and we'll discuss the importance of those the regular reviews in a second. Okay, but before we get there, so Andreea, can you share with us then what are some of the common challenges companies face when they go about trying to define policies and procedures relating to their SAP access risk management activities?
Again, I will take a bit of a step back away from access management specific policies. I think there are two extremes. I mean, it's super easy for a company to fall into an extreme, either to have like a super slim way of governing things, which is not in reality a governing or a policy. It's just one guy that has been there in the company for the past 20 years and just knows exactly why certain things have been configured in a certain way, talking also about roles, talking also about just plain configuration. But you can also end up in the other extreme, that you focus so much on having a procedure that you start losing, not only along the way, because that's some things that anyways happens, but you start losing the purpose of why do you have this framework at all. As if it is contradicting with business objectives and allowing business to actually move fast, then by default, you are not doing a good job from defining a policy. I don't know, maybe just give an example. It's a slim governing framework. I've had companies in which we've moved ABAP developments in 5 minutes. We did start in development, I have to make it clear. And I've also seen companies which take 3 months to create a vendor, as it has to go through so many. So we need to go a bit in between, so to say.
Finding the sort of the middle ground where there's the necessary control, but that you're not making life so difficult for business that it's that things become difficult, that it becomes difficult to operate. Yeah. So, okay. So now, Emile, you quickly discussed an example there of the user access review process, but maybe if we look at another specific example, the user access request process. So someone in the organization needs additional access or is new to the company, is requesting SAP access. Obviously, there's many different sort of variations or considerations of how this process can work. Can you just maybe share with us, some of your thoughts on how to go about defining a process for the user access request process?
Yeah. So when you define that process, you need to decide who's going to approve. And often companies will will say, okay, we need maximum control, and they'll implement line managers, role owners, multiple risk owners. And then eventually that process takes not days, it sometimes takes weeks for one access request to get approved because the people responsible for the specific risks are not available, or they doesn't have a second in charge person, a 2IC that can actually perform those activities on their behalf. So often we say, okay, let's consider what's the value that all of those steps bring in that access request process. Is that maybe the line manager, he knows what that person should be doing. Maybe it makes sense for that person to be there. If there's a role owner step, does that role owner actually add benefit into that process? Or is it a case that it should maybe just be the risk owner or a function owner? So it is very company specific, but I must be conscious that then, yes, there must be a control, but it mustn't be restrictive. And I think that's specifically on what the approvers are, and also things like considering whether you want to approve things with a mitigating control or without it, and often we see companies that don't have mitigating controls defined, but they insist that it must be a mitigating control before an access request can be approved. So they take weeks in defining a mitigating control, and by the time that access request is approved, that person might not even be working for the company anymore. So that is just some of the examples there, but different things to consider.
I guess that then leads us into the next section where we say, listen, why is it so important to review your policies and procedures on a regular basis? And I think mainly I'll just jump in here because we've got a client who we do the managed services for, who I remember they came up to us quite recently and just said, listen, there are a few SAP Access Risk Management activities that are taking quite a while to get applied in the productive system. And we looked at the various sort of use cases and tried to work out, well, which of those requests were taking long and where was the bottleneck. Luckily, we had done the policies and procedures activity with this client the year before, so we had very up-to-date documentation. And we went and looked at all of the various use cases and identified, okay, well, which requests are taking a long time? Where's the bottleneck? And can we do anything about that? Can we either take one of the approval steps away? Can we decentralize any of the decision-making process, et cetera? So I think the ability to regularly review your policies and procedures allows you to keep refining the process to be more and more efficient, but at the same time still ensuring that there's the adequate control that's there. And I think a lot of companies might make the mistake of thinking that once the policies and procedures have been defined, that they can never be challenged again. And I think we must view it a little bit how we like to review access risk rule sets and say, guys, it's not cast in stone. If there needs to be changes to it, change it, make it work for your business. It needs to bring about an adequate level of control, but it also needs to work for the business. So challenge things. Just because you've been doing something for 20 years doesn't mean there's not another way of doing it that still allows you to do it with a similar level of control. So yeah, I don't know if you can add anything to that, either of you.
I'll give Andreea the first opportunity, but I've maybe got a point or two that I'll add.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the monitoring component of defining, because everyone sees it as a one-time activity, and then sighs with some sort of a relief. Oh, now we're done. Now we can move to our real deal. The monitoring and just simply keeping the feedback loop open. So you keep things adjusted both to your risk appetite, but also to how things might not necessarily work as intended. As you define on paper a policy, but then once you apply it in operations, there will be exceptions. And there I also want to mention that the policy should also not necessarily always incorporate those exceptions, because then you, again, very easily end up into 200 pages, different use cases and different exceptions. So it should be high level enough that it covers, I don't know, maybe 95% of your use cases, and then just manage by exception, but allow yourself indeed this luxury of sitting and assessing, hey, is this still valid? So super good point.
Yeah. So do you think organizations should look at reviewing their policies and procedures similar to like an annual user access review? Commit on a periodic basis, whether that's annually, and as Andreea said there, look at each of the use cases to see, which ones are working well and are any causing some bottlenecks or causing delays in the process, and to see if it can be refined from there.
Yeah, definitely. So what I like to do is when I advise customers on the specific topic and say, it's almost that you are working on two policies and procedures. One is a future state. Where do I want to get to? But it makes no sense for you to try and force a specific process just because whoever has recommended that. So let's use that same example of the user access request with a role owner, with a risk owner. If you don't have people that can perform that function or have the SAP knowledge to do it, then define at least just a policy that's suitable for the maturity level of your organization. And as you grow, then you move towards that future state because there's improvement to be made, but you need to continuously assess where are you as an organization, what has changed, either people, or software, or technology, and how do we then adjust our policies to fit our organization at that point in time.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we spoke a little bit earlier about how the policies and procedures that can be used to just help the business users understand the process, that they don't get frustrated. But, is there anything more we can speak about with just the value of having up-to-date policies and procedures to be used more as an education tool for the various stakeholders, that they know exactly what is expected of them and in what timeframes, etc. I think, Emile, we've seen a lot of companies implement access control solutions, and there's sometimes very little involvement from the business users, and a lot of those. And we often look at that and feel, listen, the business users don't know what's expected of them. No, and is there not an argument for saying by defining your policies and procedures in a good document and sharing that with the relevant stakeholders and using that as an educational tool, that not only will they then start understanding why certain things take so long and they don't get frustrated, but they also might start doing certain activities, performing them at a better level because they know what's expected of them, or they know under what conditions they're allowed to do certain things.
Yes, so I want to touch back on the point I made earlier about almost defining ownership at that lower level. Because if I'm responsible for a smaller activity or smaller portion of that policies and procedures, then I'll take ownership and make sure that the users that's responsible for executing that specific policy, they're aware of what they need to do. As we said, that is meant to make the process go faster. So if they know exactly when to expect this, what's expected of them, we can make sure that they understand how to perform those tasks and what are the kind of the things for them to look out for. So I think if we can get those correct people involved, and yes, as you say, the education then becomes super important, because otherwise you're not moving ahead. So you'll forever be in the same process where you almost need to go through retraining every year when the annual user access review comes around. So if that becomes, if there's kind of dedicated ownership, I think they would be, that would result in good improvement.
Perfect. Okay, so Andreea, maybe just to end then with you. I know we've touched on some of this before, but like, if for many organizations that they've got outdated, either no policies or procedures defined, or very outdated policies and procedures, how do companies go about starting defining their policies and procedures to be applicable to them? Have you got any sort of tips or recommendations or things you've seen that have worked well to just assist the organizations get going?
Mm-hmm. And there, I think the genuine starting point is, again, business, because IT will, in reality, never be able to tell what are the critical processes. If things get broken, what's really the real impact on business within that specific company. So engage with business to really start looking at what are at least a minimal baseline of risks that you want to look at. So don't start from the IT and tooling perspective, because then you end up shoving into business a set of functionalities that are available, but then they might not need them, or they might not even resonate with what you're trying to show to them. There are also companies that have no policy. And I see that, again, a bit of a comparison. I'm a very metaphorical person. It's like when you want to start a new life and you want to start a diet, and you tell yourself, I've already screwed it up this week. I'll start next Monday. And I see that a lot of companies that are sort of rolling their processes, especially IT and risk-related processes, through some sort of an inertia, that they're very avoidant of documenting things up. And I've heard a very interesting statement around that it feels for them like it's putting lipstick on a pig. But sometimes it is also super important to just document where you are. And I loved that parallel with having two policies. We are here, meaning we have nothing, and that's okay. Maybe it takes some guts to admit it, but yes, we are here, we have nothing, but we want to work towards this direction. So have a created backlog of where you want to be, because also that target, let's say, policy shouldn't be too unicorn, shouldn't be too far stretch. And start prioritizing some small initiatives that you want to work on. But always start from risk, and risk then genuinely not coming from a risk manager practitioner, but in your day-to-day business, what's the worst thing that can happen? And they will tell you, because they really know. They've probably also experienced it themselves. And interestingly enough, these people, they are already doing those activities. So if we just speak to them, most of the time, I think we can also define a policy that is either translated to generic activities or to access management, because they can help us protect their sensitive areas. Yeah, we can then make the technical translation. So don't underestimate small steps. I think that's my main message.
So I think we've covered quite a bit there. I think so. Maybe just to summarize, then, what are the things, the takeaways from this session? I think we spoke about ownership. Defining ownership is hugely important. Also, making sure that it's maybe not just one risk owner who's responsible. Finding appropriate people within each section of the business who understands how that process works to be the owners. We spoke about regular reviews of the policies and procedures. Challenge them. If it's not working for your organization, look at that and say, well, what can we change to make it work for the business users? And then, Andreea, as you said, listen, for those companies that don't have anything, just get started. And just look at your use cases, look at the various scenarios, and just document how you're doing it now. And as Emile said, you can always have a as-is policy and procedure, and you can always have a what's it going to be, what's the best case scenario, what's the to be, and you can sort of work towards there. It's a journey, as with most things in our space. It's not done overnight, and before you know it, hopefully you'll have policies and procedures that works for you and your business users understand and agree with, and things are all working as they should. Okay, well, thanks, guys, for that. That was Andreea. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your experience and expertise. We really appreciate it. And to everyone listening, I hope we shared some valuable information that you can use. Thanks for listening. Until the next one, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.